Sandy Koufax, the left-handed pitcher you see now, played for the Los Angeles Dodgers during the 1960s, and he dominated hitters in a manner not seen since Walter Johnson. He wasn't the only pitcher on his team with such speed and craft. Teammate Don Drysdale was an intimidating sidearm pitcher who could be as dominating as Koufax. Elsewhere in the major leagues, pitchers had banner years. Denny McLain of the Detroit Tigers won 30 games, and Bob Gibson of the St. Louis Cardinals set a modern major league record for earned run average. The 1960s was a decade of demographic changes, political crises, and social evolution. The decade ended with two Americans walking on the moon, but back on Earth, the country roiled with tumult. Young Americans opposed the Vietnam War, racial injustice sparked destructive riots in several cities, and cultural attitudes towards sex and drugs were shifting. Baseball players, as we will see, reflected the mood of a different era. This is John Bodden, Professor of History, and today I'm talking about westward expansion, unionization, and the year of the pitcher. The 1960 U.S. Census revealed a remarkable trend. Cities in Texas and California were growing at a truly stunning pace. Millions moved west, and another subset of citizens on the East Coast retired to Florida. By 1965, California had become the most populous state in the Union, surpassing New York. And by the end of the decade, California had 3 more major league teams than any other state in the Republic. Last lecture I talked about the departure of the New York Giants and Brooklyn Dodgers in 1958 for San Francisco and Los Angeles respectively. During the 1960s, other major league teams moved to or were established in Anaheim, San Diego, Houston, Minneapolis, Atlanta, and Oakland. During their first 4 years in Los Angeles, the Dodgers played games at the Coliseum, a large stadium built for the Olympics in 1932, not for baseball games. And it was here that some of the largest crowds ever to see a professional baseball game filled the seats. In 1962, Dodgers owner Walter O'Malley finished construction of a new stadium that made a statement about the future. It had massive parking lots to accommodate suburban fans. There was no mass transit to the ballpark, but it was close to several highways in an era of advancing highway construction and highway congestion. The stadium removed seats and advertisements from center field, and this was done to ensure such things did not interfere with a batter's line of sight. The stadium could accommodate over 50,000 fans, the most in Major League Baseball, and its cheapest seats remained affordable to anyone until recently. During the first decade of the 21st century, you could still buy a $5 ticket for the upper deck and pavilion. In short, Dodger Stadium provided a template for a new kind of ballpark with ample parking, freeway access, no outfield distractions, and a new kind of business model. The Houston Astros also innovated. The team's owner built a dome stadium to protect fans from Houston's summer thunder showers and humid heat. It meant concerts and other events could take place, rain or shine. But covering the stadium precluded the use of natural grasses, so the grounds crew had to install artificial turf, or astroturf. Baseball purists, did not like these changes. Baseball, they said, is about the smell of the grass and the fresh summer air. More significantly, the ball moved faster over turf, affecting bounces and infield hits. Players could literally run faster on turf. And so the era, the 1960s and beyond, sped up. Stolen bases per game shot up. This new playing context is an appropriate place to mention something called park factors, or how individual ballparks affect hitting and pitching. Dodger Stadium, for instance, had ample foul territory and relatively deep fences. Both factors favored pitchers. Similarly, the Astrodome's dead indoor air and deep outfield fences favored pitchers once again. Yankee Stadium, by contrast, had a right field fence just 314 feet away from home plate, and that park factor aided left-handed sluggers like Babe Ruth, and another New York Yankee hitter named Roger Maris. In 1961, Maris hit 61 home runs, breaking Babe Ruth's single-season record of 60. What's revealing about the record is that many sports writers, as well as the Commissioner of Baseball, were not excited about this achievement. They assigned great importance to the Babe and his records. Critics pointed out that Babe Ruth hit his 60 home runs in fewer games than Maris. And that takes me to another important point. Major League Baseball had just decided to extend the number of games per season from 154 to 162. That's remarkable to me because it instantly made single-season accomplishments more difficult to compare. Why did the league do it? Well, more games played means more paying fans. Other playing contexts had changed since 1927 when the Babe set his record as well. Night baseball is one. Longer travel days is another. How did these changes affect contemporary player performance in the 1960s? I raise these issues only to reinforce a point, that every playing era has its own peculiar context. Many things remain the same in baseball, but there's always change. Babe Ruth did not face the best pitchers of the Negro Leagues. He didn't play under stadium lights for most of his career. After the 1961 season, the Commissioner of Baseball, Ford Frick, wanted fewer home runs. He didn't like Maris's record, and so Major League Baseball decided to widen the strike zone. The result was immediate: fewer home runs and fewer hits. Hank Aaron, born Henry Aaron in Mobile, Alabama, got his start in the Negro League before signing a contract to play with the Milwaukee Braves. Aaron had a long, consistent career. Year in and year out, he usually batted above 300 and hit somewhere between 30 and 45 home runs. By the end of his career, it was clear that he was on track to surpass the Babe. And once again, some baseball fans did not like it. Racists did not like the fact that he was black, and Aaron received death threats from some of those people. But even separating his skin color from the issue, not all people liked it when he passed the Babe. One thing that strikes me about Hank Aaron is both the consistency and durability of his career. In 1973, at age 39, he hit 40 home runs in just 392 at-bats. Remarkable. Pete Rose got his start in Major League Baseball during the 1960s, and he was a superb contact hitter, someone who bunted for singles and stretched many singles into doubles through aggressive base running. Rose got a nickname, Charlie Hustle, for his style of play, and he reminded older Americans of Ty Cobb. Rose would slide headfirst into bases and barrel over catchers while he was coming home. At the end of his career in the 1980s, he passed Ty Cobb as the all-time hits leader. But as we will see in a future lecture, Pete Rose did not gain admission into the Baseball Hall of Fame for his accomplishments. He entered into baseball purgatory, much like shoeless Joe Jackson. The way Major League Baseball signed talented ball players to contracts underwent a significant change during the 1960s, just as the baby boom generation was starting to graduate from high school. You will recall that New York teams dominated baseball in the 1950s, and part of the reason for that dominance was the greater number of scouts that each team could field and the bonuses they could pay. Well, in 1965, Major League Baseball created a new mechanism for assigning amateur baseball players from high schools, colleges, and other amateur clubs to its teams. Crucially, draft order got determined by the previous season's standings. So teams with the worst records got to pick first from available talent. Later on, teams that lost free agents could be awarded compensatory picks. So the system was designed to facilitate competitive balance and keep the worst performing teams from remaining the worst performing teams. And for teams with lower payrolls and smaller markets, the draft became thoroughly essential to their success. In 1965, the Los Angeles Dodgers won the World Series for the third time in 7 years, and they would go again to the World Series in 1966. Much of the team's success had to do with Sandy Koufax, right, and Don Drysdale pictured in the middle. They knew it, Major League Baseball knew it, and they wanted a pay raise. Walter O'Malley, pictured left, wanted to pay them as little as he possibly could. And at this time, teams routinely refused to reveal contract amounts, and they would play teammates off each other. For instance, the Dodgers general manager, Buzzy Bavasi, told Drysdale that he wanted more than Koufax, and then he told Koufax that he wanted more money than Drysdale. And so this game occurred in a cloud. There was little transparency. This is an era before sports agents. So in 1966, on the suggestion of Drysdale's wife, Ginger, the two star pitchers decided to negotiate their contracts together. Doing so would give them greater leverage, and the two men went to the front office and demanded $1 million divided jointly over the next 3 seasons. In other words, they wanted 3-year deals worth $500,000 each. This kind of multi-year deal is typical for star athletes today. It was atypical then. So both players, they hired an entertainment lawyer to negotiate for them. And to give you a sense of scale, they were asking for about $40,000 more per season than Willie Mays, baseball's highest paid player in 1965. He earned about $125,000, which adjusted for inflation is about $1 million. The Dodgers owner, Walter O'Malley, was furious. He and the other owners knew that allowing players to negotiate multi-year contracts would set a bad precedent from their perspective. No other teams, it's important to mention, offered this pair of star pitchers what they wanted, despite the fact that had any owner signed Drysdale and Koufax, they almost certainly would have got a trip to the World Series out of it. O'Malley refused to negotiate with their lawyer. Koufax and Drysdale held out too. They signed a contract to appear in a movie. They didn't report to spring training in Florida. But after 4 weeks and an ongoing public relations battle, they relented. Koufax ended up getting the same pay as Willie Mays, $125,000. Drysdale got $110,000. Well, I mention all of this because labor grievances among Major League Baseball players are old, as old as the game itself. Players resented this reserve clause that we've been talking about. They resented their lack of bargaining power. And you'll remember that the Supreme Court upheld a precedent that Major League Baseball was not subject to antitrust laws, and so owners and franchises could behave like monopolies. They could collude. Well, this event and ongoing grievances led to an important development. Unionization was obviously one way to gain bargaining power. And so players sought outside expertise, and the search led them to Marvin Miller, a highly respected economist for the United Steelworkers of America. And he immediately began to mold baseball players into a bona fide labor union. His first steps were to shore up the union's finances by beginning a group licensing program and educating the players about the fundamentals of organization and solidarity. In 1968, Miller helped players negotiate the first ever collective bargaining agreement in professional sports, and that agreement raised the minimum salary in baseball from $6,000 a year to $10,000, and it set the tone for future advances. In 1970, Miller helped players negotiate the right to arbitration to resolve grievances, and that was an achievement Miller considered the most significant of the union's early years because the process paved the way for future gains. 1968 has been dubbed the year of the pitcher. Several incredible things happened that season. First, Bob Gibson of the St. Louis Cardinals set the all-time ERA record, posting a 1.12 ERA. And for those of you who aren't big baseball fans, this is a truly incredible figure. It means that for every 9 innings of work, every 9-inning game he pitched, he would give up just 1 run. And that year he pitched over 300 innings. So he was just unhittable all season long. Denny McLain of the Detroit Tigers won 31 games. This has never been repeated, never accomplished since. Don Drysdale of the Los Angeles Dodgers pitched 5 consecutive shutouts, so 5 games, didn't give up a single run. Across Major League Baseball, there were 339 shutouts in 1,619 games. Shutouts are infrequent, uncommon today. And so what this means is that the average runs scored went way down. There were fewer home runs. There were more strikeouts. The best hitter in the American League, Carl Yastrzemski, future Hall of Famer, was the batting champion of the league with a .301 average. And typically the batting champion hits above 330. So Major League Baseball had a problem on its hands. Pitchers were just too dominant. Fans wanted to see more hitting. And so during the winter, the owners met, and they did what owners had always done. They changed the rules. The pitching mound, its height was lowered from 15 inches to 10 inches. This is huge. This gave hitters a big advantage, while the owners also wanted a narrower strike zone. That was another change to facilitate offensive production. 4 expansion teams, the Kansas City Royals, Montreal Expos, San Diego Padres, and Seattle Pilots, also diluted the relative dominance of Major League pitching because the expansion teams had to rely on rosters of less than dominant players. A lot more minor leaguers came up and pitched. And so from one perspective, competitive balance was restored. Batting averages went up. The number of runs scored went up. Baseball purists went mad, right? We've said that baseball can be a conservative game. How dare you change the eternal rules of baseball? Of course, you as students of the game know now that the rules have been changing since the beginning in 1845 when the Knickerbockers established their rules. So that was a major development. Now I want to talk about the 60s as a decade of cultural and political shifts. If you look at pictures of baseball games in the 1940s and 1950s, most fans visited baseball stadiums in suits and dresses. And that began to change in the mid-60s. People wore more comfortable clothing. They brought beach balls to the ballpark. And so people coming to the ballpark brought more relaxed ideas about the public sphere. The baby boom generation was reaching adulthood in the late 60s, and they brought new ideas and attitudes to society. The civil rights movement was ongoing through the decade. And I should mention that Jackie Robinson, who retired from baseball in 1956, flew to Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, where he marched in support of Martin Luther King Jr.'s effort to fight the city's segregation laws. The March on Washington occurred in 1963. This is the event where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. And not long after, Birmingham, Alabama's 16th Street Baptist Church, a black church, was bombed by white terrorists. So there was racial conflict in the country and resistance to integration and violence. There were also countercurrents as well. Not far away, the Atlanta Braves, not far away from Birmingham, the Atlanta Braves integrated. Black and white players ate together and stayed in the same hotels, and their home stadium was not segregated. After 1965, young people increasingly expressed discontent about U.S. military involvement in Vietnam, where ultimately more than 50,000 young Americans would die and countless others come home wounded. For young people, baseball probably seemed traditional, conservative, something the establishment liked to follow, something your dad liked to talk about. And perhaps that perception is unchanged to some extent in the 21st century. But baseball was not immune to the political and cultural ferment of the 60s. Young baseball players, or at least some baseball players, challenged the older guardians of the game. Curt Flood, an excellent outfielder for the St. Louis Cardinals, received notice at the end of the 1969 season that he would be traded to the Philadelphia Phillies. Well, Flood didn't want to go to Philadelphia. The Phillies were one of the last teams to integrate. He hadn't heard good things about the city, and he wanted some modicum of choice. He wanted to have a say-so. So in a letter to baseball's commissioner, Bowie Kuhn, he wrote, quote, "After 12 years in the major leagues, I do not feel that I'm a piece of property to be bought and sold, irrespective of my wishes." And and he wanted the commissioner to know that he would accept offers from other teams, but he didn't want to go without having any input. And Flood ultimately brought a case against Major League Baseball that went to the Supreme Court. We'll talk about that next lecture. And Flood argued that the reserve clause violated his constitutional rights, notably the 13th Amendment, which had banned slavery. Another example of a young ball player defying his elders was the publication of Ball 4 by Jim Bouton. Bouton was a pitcher for the New York Yankees in his prime, and later on he decided to keep a diary during the 1969 season. In his book, he told the truth about Major League Baseball, what the coaches and players said and did. He didn't shield star players such as Mickey Mantle, his former teammate, from accounts of what Mantle did, pranks he played, his wild nights of drinking and misbehaving. He told the truth about contract negotiations and clubhouse tensions. So it was a countercultural statement. Before Ball 4, books about professional athletes were ghostwritten for mass audiences. Journalists who wrote those books, they covered up things. They didn't write about Babe Ruth's drinking or womanizing because they thought this would be inappropriate. It would be bad for the youth of America. Well, Ball 4 changed that. The book treated professional athletes as human beings with flaws and foibles. Okay, so Major League Baseball is furious about this book. The commissioner of baseball, Bowie Kuhn, wanted Bouton to say that what he had written was untrue, it was all lies, fabricated. Bouton refused, and he becomes a persona non grata. Ball players and the baseball establishment were not happy with Bouton. But the book was a harbinger of an age to come, our time, when public figures are subject to much greater scrutiny. They're not placed on pedestals to the same degree as they once were. Times, you could say, were changing.